Hello everyone, I am Jeeps_, and if you don't know me, I have a few channels here on YouTube, and this is one of them. Today, we will be starting a series and also posting the first ever video here. Murderous Meals will be a cooking adventure for all of us, where we take the final meals of infamous killers and, well, cook them. And we're also going to talk about them a little podcast style. Today's first ever episode will be covering Theodore Robert Bundy, famously known as Ted Bundy, the campus killer. In front of me are the ingredients for his final meal before being executed on January 24th, 1989, in the Ryford electric chair. Ted didn't request a meal for his final hours, so he got the standard death row meal: a steak, over easy eggs, hash browns, a glass of milk, a glass of juice, and toast with butter and jelly. We'll talk through the food prep, cooking, and plating, all while diving into the life of Ted Bundy. So, starting with prep, I'm going to go ahead and get the steaks seasoned up and the eggs set in a deli container, as well as go ahead and butter our bread and grate some hash brown from some fresh potatoes. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, what seemed to be a respectable and bright young man would enter the basement apartment of a student at UW in Seattle, Washington. This would be the first documented case of Ted Bundy breaking and entering to attack his first victim. Ted would take a metal rod and bludgeon the young lady and sexually assault her with the same rod. She would miraculously survive the encounter with Bundy, but be left with permanent damage to her body and life. Just a month later, Ted would enter the basement room of Linda Ann Healy, also from UW, to beat her unconscious, dress her, and carry her away to a secluded area where he would finish the job. Ted would continue to scour the Seattle area with a disappearance rate of young women of about 1 per month, and eventually moving on to Oregon State University to claim victims. The Seattle and Oregon murder spree would culminate of sorts at the very crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park. There, Ted would wrap his arm around a sling and tempt young women to help him load a boat from his very recognizable brown Volkswagen Beetle. This was in broad daylight, and several people turned down the charming man walking around the beach, introducing himself as Ted, until he approached a probation caseworker named Janice Ott, who agreed to help Ted at his car. Several people saw them leave the scene, and about 4 hours later, Ted would return, hunting down a second victim in the form of a young computer programmer that would leave her picnic at the beach to never be seen again. The police finally start to catch on here and realize that maybe this scour of terror is being caused by the same person, and are able to get a sketch of the man known as Ted. The police released this sketch out on the news and got thousands of replies from the public, one of them being Ted's girlfriend, Elizabeth Klepfer. On September 6th, 2 hunters just happened to cross the skeletal remains of the 2 Lake Sammamish victims just 2 miles east of the state park that they had last been seen. 6 months later, the remains of 4 other of Ted's victims would be found on Taylor Mountain, a frequent area for Bundy, but in the meantime, Ted received a second acceptance letter to the University of Utah Law School and made his way to Salt Lake City. A new string of homicides would begin just a month after his arrival. Ted claimed several victims in gruesome ways, and in a late afternoon on November 8th, came across Carol Duranch. At the time, Ted was posing as a local county police officer and coerced Duranch to his car under the guise of needing her at the local police station. Ted would attempt to handcuff her, but she would fight back, and in a mishap from Bundy by clasping the other side of the cuffs on the same arm, she was able to escape the clutches of the killer. The first absolutely major slip by Bundy would throw him into a fit of rage, leading him to drive 20 miles north to claim a different victim. Make sure to like the video if you're enjoying so far. From here, Ted would go on to expand his hunting grounds to Colorado and even some in Idaho until August 16th, 1975, where he was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol in Salt Lake City after being observed suspiciously roaming a residential area in his Beetle. Officer Bob Hayward spotted a bag full of various tools, including a ski mask with holes for the eyes and mouth in it, and a crowbar. Bob Hayward thought he had come across a simple thief and arrested him. For the time, Ted was released due to no damning proof, but by now the police were more than suspicious that this man just may be the elusive Ted, and they had one thing on their side: Carol Duranch. The The police called in the escaped victim of Ted Bundy and had Ted himself stand in a lineup where Carol was able to pick him out instantly as the man who tried to kidnap her. Ted was charged with kidnapping and assault at first, yet over about a month time frame, Colorado authorities were able to officially charge the man with murder. Ted was in the Garfield County Jail at the time and would often climb to the top of his bunk, jump off of it all throughout the day, and sprint very specific distances. This is because Ted had convinced the judge to let him defend himself in the court of law, allowing him access to a special library located in the Pitkin County Courthouse. Shielded by a large bookshelf from courthouse officials, Ted jumped out the second-story window of the courthouse, shed his layer of clothing, and hiked south onto Aspen Mountain into the brutal Colorado winter. After about 6 days of extreme cold and lack of nutrition, Ted broke into a camping trailer just outside of Aspen to claim some food and warm clothing before stealing a car and driving back into Aspen. All these conditions, as well as the swelling pain in his ankle he injured from the fall from the courthouse, caused him to drive erratically and eventually get pulled over by the police once again, sending him back to jail. The last thing we'll be doing in prep here is to make sure that we not only sit those potatoes in cold water to get the starch out, but also wring them out with some paper towels. This will help dry out those potatoes as much as possible and give that crispy brown color. This is my first time doing homemade hash browns, so very exciting. I think we're just about prepped now, so let's move on to the cooking phase and talk a little bit more about the early life of Ted Bundy before moving on. As we begin to cook, we're going to go ahead and focus on getting those ribeye steaks in a hot pan first and letting them sit for about 4 minutes each side, which ended up being a tad bit too long, but it's alright. After they cook about halfway, we'll give them a flip and cook our over easy eggs and homemade hash browns in the smaller pan over here. Ted was the result of a fling between his mother and a never truly confirmed father. On the day of November 24th, 1946, Ted Cowell would be born. His mother, overwhelmed by being abandoned by the paternal father and the weight of having the child, would take Ted to an orphanage nearby and give him up for adoption. After returning home, her father and Ted's grandfather would convince her to bring that boy home and raise him up right. Even with this, Ted spent a large majority of his life under the false reality that his mother was actually his sister and his grandparents were his true parents. Eventually, Ted would find out the truth of his birth with varying recollections of his own in prison. Most notably, him coming across his own birth certificate and discovering the lack of father and supposed sister's name as his mother. It would seem these would be the pilot flame of whatever grew into Ted Bundy's hatred and distrust towards women. In 1951, Ted's mother would meet Johnny Culpepper Bundy, and they would marry and officially adopt Ted after, creating the name we know as Ted Bundy. The truth about Ted's grandfather is up in the air, but some locals would describe him as a fine man, whereas others would contribute his raging alcoholism and violent nature, specifically towards animals, as one of the reasons that Ted became the violent monster he was. It was by the time that he was in high school that Ted began to realize he had a true disconnect with the average person. He wanted to be this popular and suave, smooth-talking and cunning individual that he just couldn't be. Ted chose to be alone most of the time during these days. Just reading the Wikipedia about some of the terrorizing of smaller children in the woods and animal cruelty committed while he was younger is astonishing. I suggest you give it a read yourself because most documentaries I've seen don't mention it. If we haven't already, we need to go ahead and get those steaks flipped and go ahead and get started on our over easy eggs. For the eggs, I managed to break the first yolk immediately, but it's okay because I'm cooking for two tonight. The trick to an over easy egg is to drop these ovals in and add a splash of water or butter and cover it. Once the white cooks over the top and around the yolk, you should be ready to pull. You can also flip it, but that's a lot of work. In 1966, Bundy would attend the University of Washington and find his first real girlfriend, fellow student Diane Edwards. Bundy was always concerned that he wasn't or couldn't be the man Diane deserved, as she came from a much higher class than him. Around August 1968, Diane would leave Ted because she saw him as someone who lacked ambition and maturity, devastating Bundy, causing him to travel to visit relatives in Arkansas and enroll at Temple University. Around this time is when he discovered his true parentage before returning to Washington in the fall of 1969, where he met the previously mentioned Elizabeth Klepfer. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, by the way, if you made it this far. Ted and Elizabeth would remain together on and off well into his initial incarceration, and Ted would even become something of a father figure to Elizabeth's daughter. Bundy would become goal-oriented and much more focused, re-enrolling at UW as a psychology major. This time around, Ted was a picture-perfect student with good grades and described as an empathetic person. Ted would venture into the political world by joining the Governor Daniel Evans re-election campaign in 1972. During a trip on his Republican Party business, Ted would rekindle the flames with Diane, all the while remaining with his girlfriend Elizabeth. Ted would see Diane for some time until he had made her fall in love, even wanting to marry him, to which Ted responded by leaving her for good. Ted wanted the control, and he wanted the gratification of being the person she wanted but couldn't have. According to him, he just wanted to prove to himself that he could marry her. Coincidentally, most of Ted's victims would go on to fit the characteristics of Diane Edwards. It's about time to drop these hash browns in. We're going to take our grated potatoes and get them into the pan, squishing them down to make a sort of patty. We'll just let them sit for a bit and watch as the edges crisp up. Occasionally, we can go ahead and add some small cubes of butter to the sides of the pan to help with that crispiness. I actually used the lid from a pot to help me flip these easier. Ted would start his venture into crime as a peeping Tom, creeping on women from outside their homes. Ted's first murders are up in the air before his first actual documented case. Ted confessed to dozens of murders in the days leading up to his execution, and some even believe he started killing in his teens. But now that the food is just about done, it's time to get to the end of his story. So, I realized after I moved everything that I totally forgot to toast our toast. So, the big thing on that is just buttering up some bread and dropping it in the pan at a low heat. Keep an eye on it because it can burn easily. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and start plating up everything else on a nice white platter with a black plate and pour our liquids while preparing the butter and jelly. Bundy, still jailed for his accused murder in Colorado, called for a change of scenery to Denver. What Bundy didn't know was the place he would be moved to was notoriously hard on murder suspects. Bundy would stop eating meals and lose a significant amount of weight. This was so he could pile the books he had in his cell under his blankets to pose as a person and break through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer. Bundy would then change into some street clothes from the jailer's closet and simply walk out the front door to his freedom on December 30th, 1977. Bundy would take an extremely convoluted route from Chicago to reach Tallahassee, Florida. After about a week of being there, Ted would break into the Chi Omega sorority house and brutally assault 4 young women staying there in a quick succession, in a matter of about 15 minutes. Fortunately, 2 would survive, but the other 2 would fall to their injuries, one being a gruesome bite to the buttocks. After, just 8 blocks away and while the police were still on the scene at Chi Omega, Ted would break into a basement apartment and assault another victim. This one left alive as well. Bundy would then drive 150 miles to Jacksonville, Florida in a stolen van where he would attempt to approach a 14-year-old girl. But fortunately, her brother was around and was able to sway him off. Oh, don't forget to leave a comment down below about anything you'd like if you made it this far, by the way. This didn't stop Ted, as he would backtrack 60 miles to Lake City, Florida, where he would lure 12-year-old Kimberly Leach away from her school and tragically take her life. Her remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park, which was 35 miles away from Lake City. Bundy began to grow suspicious the police were onto him once again, so he stole a car and began fleeing west across the Florida Panhandle, where a police officer pulled him over near the Alabama state line. Bundy would then assault the officer, but he was able to tackle him, finally arresting one of the FBI's 10 most wanted men at the time, unbeknownst to him. Bundy would be indicted on charges of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and burglary for his terror on the Chi Omega sorority house. Ted Bundy's trial would be the first ever televised for the United States. Ted seemingly sabotaged himself at every turn. His court-appointed lawyers were able to come to a plea agreement that would garner a life sentence over the Florida death penalty. Ted would agree to this and then completely embarrass his law team in front of the courthouse, ending up in Ted being the last man standing. After crucial testimony against Ted and overwhelming evidence, which included a cast of his teeth that perfectly matched the buttocks of the Chi Omega sorority girl, Ted was sentenced to death by electrocution on February 10th, 1980. Ted was given a death sentence a total of 3 times. During the trial, Ted would garner the attention of women all over the world, becoming a bit of an icon to them. One in particular would be Carol Ann Boone. Ted Bundy and Carol Boone would develop a romantic relationship over the time of the trial. Carol Ann Boone was convinced of Ted's innocence and would even go see him for conjugal visits, eventually resulting in the prison guards turning a naked eye to their actions. During his trial, Ted would call Carol to the stand and ask her to marry him, making it immediately official due to some loopholes in Florida law. Carol Ann Boone would give birth to the child of Ted Bundy on October 24th, 1981. Ted would spend the remainder of his life on death row, prying for more and more time. He would conduct interviews with journalist Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, and eventually offer his expertise of serial killer activity and thought process to the FBI. Eventually, though, time was up. On the day of Ted Bundy's execution, people old and young from all over gathered at the Florida State Prison, celebrating the momentous occasion. People grilled out, sold unique Ted Bundy execution antiquities, and there were even some fireworks. All the while, Ted Bundy would turn down his final meal and receive the standard meal before execution: steak, over-easy eggs, hash browns, juice, milk, and toast with jelly and butter. All the way to the chair, Ted continued to confess to murders in the attempt to buy more time. But on Tuesday, January 24th, 1989, Ted would sit in the Ryford electric chair, have a bag placed over his head, and the switch pulled, sending thousands of volts through his body and ending his life. Ted Bundy would confess to a total of 30 murders of young women across 7 states by the time of his execution, though the number is expected to be much higher. I think it's ironic, in a way, the way those people celebrated the death of Ted Bundy. It's just another example of horrid human nature on both sides of the fence. Ted Bundy did not eat a single bite of his final meal. Thanks for watching.